For just over a decade, the northeast corner of Syria was home to, well, one of the most unique political experiments of the 21st century.
It really was. You had this autonomous zone run by the Kurds, basically sandwiched between hostile neighbors, and it was operating on this utopian blend of leftist ideology, direct democracy, and really aggressive women's empowerment.
Right, and this was happening in the middle of a region that is, traditionally very conservative. It was this fascinating anomaly that Western observers, and honestly a lot of people on the left around the world, they looked at it with almost starry eyes. But if you're looking at the headlines today, or rather this stack of reports we have in front of us, that experiment is over.
Effectively, yes. The headline facts are pretty brutal. The Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, who were the United States' primary partner in the ground war against ISIS, have suffered what's being called a decisive defeat.
And just so we're all on the same page, this isn't just a skirmish, this is a map-changing event. But before we get into the who controls what now, we should probably set the stage, because the last 18 months have been, a total blur.
Extremely fast.
Yeah.
Just to orient everyone, Bashar al-Assad was finally toppled back in December 2024, which effectively ended that long civil war.
Right.
Since then, the new president, Ahmed al-Shara, has been on a mission to consolidate power and, in his words, to reunify the country.
And that brings us to the mission of this deep dive. We've gone through the articles, the State Department cables, the field reports. We are going to unpack exactly how the U.S. switched partners almost in the blink of an eye.
And the absolute chaos that erupted during the handover, including some truly terrifying details about ISIS prisons.
And then the specific terms of a new deal that effectively just erases an autonomous region from the map.
It's a story about realpolitik, betrayal, and the messy, really dangerous business of trying to build a state out of the ashes of a war.
So let's start with the hard reality on the ground. When the reports say decisive defeat, what does that actually look like? Because the SDF wasn't a small operation. They controlled a huge chunk of Syria.
At their peak, yeah, they held nearly a third of the country. But the sources are clear. This wasn't a negotiation between equals. This was a collapse. After an 18-month ceasefire completely fell apart in January, the new Syrian government troops, they just pushed hard into the northeast.
And looking at the map, they didn't just take empty desert, they went for the jugular.
They did. The SDF has handed over the Omar facility, that is the country's largest oil field. They've also surrendered the strategic Tabqa Dam on the Euphrates River.
Which is huge. If you control the Omar field, you control the fuel. If you control the Tabqa Dam, you control the water and the electricity.
Exactly. These are the economic engines of the state. So once the SDF lost those, their capacity to function as an autonomous entity basically evaporated. You can't run a government without revenue and power.
Okay, so the land is gone, the resources are gone, but what about the people, the fighters? The SDF had this massive military structure. Are they just disbanding, going home?
No. And this is where the integration part of the deal gets really complicated. They aren't just disappearing, they are being absorbed.
Absorbed.
The agreement states that the SDF will form a military division consisting of 3 brigades. These brigades are, on paper, made up of former SDF members, but they sit firmly within the command structure of the Syrian army.
Wait, hold on. Let's do the math on that. 3 brigades. The SDF had tens of thousands of fighters. 3 brigades sounds like a tiny fraction of that force.
It is significantly smaller.
Yeah.
And it's not just the fighters. The deal requires the integration of their civil institutions, the local councils, all the administrative bodies, into the central government in Damascus.
I have to be honest, reading through these reports, the language uses words like integration and unification, but this sounds like a total capitulation.
It's hard to read it any other way. One of our sources puts it very bluntly. The SDF had no cards left to play. They were facing a military offensive from a newly unified, energized Syrian army. And crucially, they looked over their shoulder for their American partners, and nobody was there.
Which brings us to the pivot, the United States.
The elephant in the room.
Because this is the part that feels the most jarring. The Kurds fought and died for the U.S. against ISIS. We're talking about 11,000 Kurdish lives lost in that fight. They were the boots on the ground, so Americans didn't have to be. So how does Washington explain letting this happen?
Well, if you look at the statements from U.S. officials, they're framing it as a success of policy. We have quotes here from the U.S. Special Envoy to Syria, a guy named Tom Barrack, from just last month. January 2026.
And he used a very specific word regarding the SDF, didn't he? A really cold one.
He did. He stated that the SDF's purpose has largely expired.
Expired. That feels like we're talking about a carton of milk, not a military ally that held the line against a caliphate.
It's brutal language. But I think we need to look at the logic behind it because it reveals a lot about how the U.S. views the region now. For 10 years, the U.S. strategy was by, with, and through. We didn't want to occupy Syria, so we used a local partner, the Kurds, to fight ISIS.
Right, that was the deal. We provide the air power, you provide the soldiers.
Exactly. But that strategy has a ceiling. The U.S. assessment now is that a militia, no matter how effective, it can't replace a state. A militia can't sign trade deals. It can't sit at the UN. It can't offer long-term stability.
So the calculation changed because the map changed. Now that there is a central government in Damascus under President al-Shara that actually functions, the U.S. is thinking, why are we backing a separatist militia when we can just back the government?
Precisely. It's extreme realpolitik. They traded a militia for a state. The sources all highlight that Washington is now prioritizing a unified Syria above all else. They just aren't willing to underwrite Kurdish separatism if they think the central government can keep a lid on things.
But surely they saw this collapse coming. It's not like the Syrian army just snuck up on the Kurds overnight.
No, not at all. The warning signs were flashing red for months. Negotiations between the Kurds and the government had completely stalled. But the key detail here, and this is what really cements the betrayal narrative, is that when al-Shara's military finally moved in to force the issue, the U.S. did little to stop them.
They just stood back and watched.
They stood back. And for the Kurdish leadership, that was the moment they realized they were a temporary tool, not a permanent partner.
Okay, so the U.S. steps back, the Syrian army steps in. In an ideal world, you'd have a smooth handover of power. You swap the flags, change the guards, life goes on.
In an ideal world, yes. But transitions of power in conflict zones are rarely smooth. And this one was chaotic and dangerous.
This is the part of the deep dive that really kept me up last night. Let's talk about the prisons, because people might forget that the SDF was guarding thousands and thousands of ISIS fighters.
Right. And as the government forces approached and the Kurdish forces withdrew to fight them, we had these massive security vacuums just opening up instantly. The sources describe a huge breakout at al-Shaddadi prison.
I read this section 3 times. I couldn't believe the timeline. You have the Kurdish guards pulling out because the Syrian army is shelling their positions.
And essentially just leaving the back door wide open.
And the number is terrifying. Something like 200 ISIS detainees escaped.
200 hardened fighters back in the wind.
But here's the detail that absolutely floored me. There is a report from a U.S. military official confirming that while this was happening, while 200 dangerous terrorists were just pouring out of the gates, U.S. surveillance drones were flying overhead watching it all happen.
High-definition video of a disaster they could no longer stop.
That is such a haunting image. Drones buzzing overhead, watching the heat signatures of these guys escaping, but no U.S. troops on the ground to intervene.
Because the order had changed. The order was do not engage. They were essentially spectators to the chaos caused by their own policy shift.
And it wasn't just the prisons, right? We have reports on the Al-Hol camp, too. And Al-Hol is, well, you should describe Al-Hol for us.
Al-Hol is just a humanitarian disaster on a massive scale. We're talking about 23,000 people, mostly families of ISIS fighters, women and children, many of them radicalized, all living in squalor.
And what happened there when the handover started?
Absolute chaos. The camp administrator, a woman named Jihan Hanan, she described scenes of families fleeing, of buildings and administrative offices burning as the Kurdish guards withdrew.
Why did the guards leave? Was it just, we give up?
Well, the SDF argument is that they had to redeploy those troops to the front lines to fight the advancing Syrian army. They argued, we can't guard ISIS families while we were being attacked by the government.
And the government, of course, says the SDF abandoned their posts on purpose just to cause chaos on their way out.
It's a classic blame game while the buildings burn. But the human element here is just devastating. Ilham Ahmed, she's the head of foreign relations for the Kurds, said something that really sticks with you about the civilians. She said, "Our people don't trust that the army will protect them."
Which is completely understandable, given the history. So you have a population that feels utterly exposed.
Exactly. We have a military defeat, a diplomatic abandonment, and now a security crisis with ISIS detainees on the loose.
It paints a very bleak picture. But I want to pivot to the political side of this deal. Because usually when you surrender, you try to get something in return. Is there any silver lining here at all?
Well, if you look at the political concessions on paper, there is something that looks quite significant.
Significant on paper usually means complicated in practice.
It does. But let's look at the decree that was issued by President al-Shara. He has formally recognized Kurdish identity for the first time since Syrian independence in 1946.
That sounds huge. 1946, that's 80 years of denial.
It is historically significant, no question. Under this new deal, Kurdish is now a national language. The Kurdish New Year, Nowruz, is a national holiday. And perhaps most importantly for the people on the ground, stateless Kurds are finally being granted nationality.
Okay, so on paper, that addresses some of the core grievances the Kurds have had for decades. They exist legally now.
They do. But this is where we have to apply some critical thinking. The sources we have are all asking a very big question. What about theory versus practice? Can these promises actually be trusted?
And I want to dig into this integration plan too, because on paper, merging 3 brigades sounds simple, but just think about the culture shock here.
Oh, it's massive. You have the SDF, which was famous for the YPJ. They're all-female combat units. You have commanders who are women actively leading men into battle, operating with a very distinct Marxist-inspired ideology.
And you're trying to weld that into the Syrian Arab Army, which is traditional, hierarchical, and now under President al-Shara is leaning much more heavily into conservative Islamic values.
It's oil and water. The sources point out that the SDF fighters aren't just losing their uniforms. They're losing their entire social structure. If you're a female commander in the SDF, do you keep your rank in the new Syrian army?
The reports seem to suggest, probably not.
Right. So integration is likely a euphemism for dissolution. The fear highlighted in the analysis is that despite the decree, Syria is becoming a highly centralized regime again. The concern is that there's very little room for actual diversity or local autonomy in a system that demands total loyalty to Damascus.
So you get the holiday, but you lose the power.
That's the trade. You get recognition, but you lose your agency.
Now, we can't talk about this region without talking about the neighbors. And there is one neighbor who has been watching this experiment with very narrowed eyes for years. Turkey.
Turkey's a huge part of this puzzle. In fact, you could argue they are the silent winners of this whole week.
They must be thrilled about the SDF losing autonomy, right? I mean, they view the Kurdish forces as an extension of the PKK, which they consider a terrorist organization.
Oh, absolutely. The collapse of an autonomous Kurdish entity on their border is a massive strategic win for President Erdogan. But the sources point out that this also expands Turkey's influence. They now have a zone of influence running all along that northern border.
So what does Erdogan do now? Does he just sit back and smile?
Well, one of our sources brings up a really fascinating and conceptual point about the Ottoman legacy.
Oh, I liked this part. But we need to break this down because Ottoman legacy can mean a lot of different things.
Right. So the source argues that both Erdogan and the U.S. envoy Tom Barrack are students of history. But there are 2 ways to interpret how the Ottoman Empire actually worked. One interpretation is the benevolent strongman. The idea that you get stability through homogenization and centralized control. Everyone speaks one language, everyone follows one rule.
The do what I say and nobody gets hurt model?
Exactly. But the other interpretation is negotiated coexistence. The Ottoman Empire, at its best, lasted for so long because it had systems, like the millet system, for different ethnic and religious groups to manage their own affairs. It wasn't about crushing diversity, it was about managing it.
So the argument is that Erdogan has a choice here. He's at a crossroads.
Yes. He could use this moment, this collapse of the SDF, to try and crush Kurdish aspirations entirely. The experiment failed, now get in line. Or he can use the Syrian integration model to maybe restart peace talks with the Kurds inside Turkey, the PKK.
That seems like a really high-stakes gamble.
It is. But the logic is, if the Syrian Kurds are no longer an armed threat on the border because they've been absorbed by Syria, maybe Turkey can afford to be more generous at home. If Turkey chooses coercion, the instability continues. If they choose coexistence, this could actually stabilize the whole region.
It's a fascinating thought that the end of the Kurdish experiment in Syria could actually open a door for peace in Turkey, or it could slam it shut forever.
And that's the uncertainty we're left with.
So let's try to pull this all together. What does this all mean for you, the listener? We've got a defeated partner, a pragmatic U.S. withdrawal, and a new Syrian state trying to glue itself back together with a very different kind of glue.
I think the aha moment here is understanding the gamble the U.S. has taken. It's not just about leaving, it's about how we left. The U.S. has traded a loyal, effective militia for a unified state government. They are betting everything on the idea that stability comes from centralization, not from autonomy.
They're betting that a strong Damascus is better than a fragmented map, even if that strong Damascus is conservative, authoritarian, and frankly, not very democratic.
Right. And even if it means sacrificing the very democratic ideals that the Kurdish experiment, for all its flaws, tried to represent, it's a return to the old status quo of the Middle East. Stability over liberty.
It's a harsh lesson in international relations. Values are nice, but interests are permanent.
That's the reality.
So as we wrap up, what's the one thing we should all be thinking about as we watch the news coming out of Syria in the next few months? Because the headlines will fade, but the situation on the ground won't.
I think the provocative thought to leave you with is this. The United States spent years shaping the battlefield, bombing ISIS, arming the Kurds, drawing lines on maps. We were very active in the war, but now it feels like we're completely refusing to shape the peace.
We're washing our hands of it.
We are. But think about the loose ends. We have ISIS detainees now loose in the desert because of this chaotic handover. We have a utopian experiment replaced by a conservative central government. We have to ask ourselves, have we actually solved the problem here, or have we just changed the jailer?
Can a unified Syria actually work if that unity is just a cover for a new form of authoritarianism?
Exactly. And with the ideological fire of ISIS still smoldering out there, removing the one force that was ideologically committed to fighting them, that's a risk. That is a risk that might come back to haunt everyone.
That is a heavy question to end on, but I think it's the right one. The map has changed, but the underlying cracks might just be covered over with a fresh coat of paint.
And only time will tell if that paint holds.
Well, thank you for walking us through this. It's a complex situation, but I feel like I understand the stakes a lot better now.
My pleasure. It's a pivotal moment for the Middle East.
And thanks to you for listening to this deep dive. We'll be keeping an eye on Syria, because if history has taught us anything, it's that things there rarely stay quiet for long. See you next time.